Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fly podcast. This is episode 124 of the Roundtable. I'm joined by Keith Preston and Florian. Now, in past roundtables, so this may be like the last 2 months, that'll be the last 4 roundtables, Keith Preston has been discussing both in-stream and then off-stream his sort of take on the new rising global financial class. So, he's pinpointed the NRX neo-feudalists, the transhumanists, people like Elon Musk, the Sun Belt versus the old Boston Brahmins. Also, his idea of a northern axis of industrialized countries working together in concert to hold down developing southern hemisphere countries, as well as the idea of overproduction of elites, which might lead to class-based revolutionary activity again. So, yes, the floor is yours, Keith. Go ahead and unpack all this for us.
Yeah, well, a lot of commentators have noticed how there seems to be a lot of changes going on in the world right now. And I think, though, that a lot of people are missing some of the key things that are happening that are the most significant. Now, there have been a number of other commentators who have observed certain trends. And I think if you fuse some of their analysis together, you get a really clear picture of what's happening, or at least you get a very theoretically plausible picture of what's happening. For instance, when it comes to the 2024 election, the guy who had the best overall set of predictions as to how that election would turn out was the guy who calls himself academic agent, Nima Parvini. He argued that the Donald Trump would likely win the 2024 election. And he argued that the real reason for this is that a lot of elites had actually switched sides. That, in particular, that the Zionist elites had lurched rightward in the aftermath of October 7th and the subsequent pro-Palestinian protests, that the Zionists were trying to weaponize conservative anti-woke in defense of Israel against the supposedly woke pro-Palestinian people. Also, the billionaires, a lot of these tech billionaires had also started moving rightward. Peter Thiel had already been in the Trump camp, but then you started to see Elon Musk and Mark Andreessen and some of these other people move in that camp. And then there were others that were trying to work both ends at the same time, Zuckerberg and Bezos and people like that. So Parvini thought that this was an indication that of a general shift in the strategy of dominant sectors within the ruling class. And that seems to have been correct. If we look at everything that's happened in the Trump administration, we see that has been the focus. There's been this pivot towards, obviously, towards the Zionists. And I mean, well, not that the Biden people weren't pro-Zionist, but we see that the Zionists, on one hand, are a dominant force in the Trump administration. And we also see these tech billionaires as a dominant force. But I do think that there's a third group that doesn't get considered quite as much in a lot of this kind of analysis. Caleb Maupin has argued, I think correctly, that within domestic American politics, there's an ongoing decades-long conflict between the traditional Northeastern establishment, the Boston Brahmins that Todd mentioned earlier, and then the rising Sun Belt capitalists that came out of the 20th century as the military-industrial complex expanded, and you started to get a lot of heavy industry and tech industries and things like that in the Sun Belt region of the United States. And I do think that for a long time, Sun Belt capitalism and the military-industrial complex were basically the owners of the Republican Party. That probably starting in the 1950s on up, through, I think that consolidated up around the 1980s and probably peaked in the George W. Bush era, or maybe slightly thereafter. But it seems like on the right, on the Republican side of the political spectrum, and within the elite in the United States, it seems like there are several groups that are now eclipsing even the military-industrial complex in terms of their dominance and influence. I've discussed two of them, the tech oligarchs and the Zionists. But the third one is what some commentators, for example, Paul Kudnick, who's an English commentator, He runs the website Winter Oak. He's sort of in the green anarchist tradition, similar to I don't Murray Bookchin or somebody like that. And also Shahid Bolson, who's an American, who's a convert to Islam. He's English speaking Muslim. I think he lives in Malaysia at present. But both of these guys have pointed out how how what they call the owners and controllers of global finance capital, that this is really the real ascendant force within the elite in the United States, within the Western world generally, and within the Trump movement in the Republican Party and the current administration. And by the owners and controllers of global finance capital, what we mean by that are these major investment firms. BlackRock is the most well known. There's also State Street, Vanguard, a number of others. And then those are all interconnected with the central banks of different countries, with sovereign wealth funds, with other major multinational corporations, with other transnational banking systems. And what these entities collectively are doing is creating a global financial system where they're interconnected with each other. So what we're moving towards is a system very similar to the 19th century. In the 19th century, we had a world that was multipolar in a geopolitical sense. You had multiple major powers that had their own empires and regional spheres of influence. You had the United States, which was obviously a growing continental power in North America, and a growing hemispheric power in the Western Hemisphere. Obviously, you had the British Empire, the French Empire, the Spanish Empire, the Dutch Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. Japan was a rising power. Mexico had its own little regional empire, and Central America. So you had this multipolar world, but then you also had this system of international concentration of capital through the city of London and that kind of stuff. And that seems to be the kind of world order we're now moving into, where we're seeing more and more multipolarity. We see that Russia is becoming more influential, China is becoming more influential, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, India, Indonesia, and some others. And we see that it looks like American power is receding. Obviously, it hasn't gone away, but it's certainly in a process of recession, from the unipolar global dominance that we had back in, say, the 1990s, early 2000s, and even more so than when we had a bipolar order during the Cold War. We're going back to a pre-World War I type of geopolitical order, even while finance capital is being concentrated on a global level. And when in the 19th century, the world order of the 19th century was a product of all of the changes that had happened in the 18th and 19th century: the Industrial Revolution, the Enlightenment, the rise of capitalism, the rise of the bourgeoisie as the dominant class, classical liberalism. We see parallels to all of that in the 21st century as well, only through financial capitalism and digital capitalism rather than industrial capitalism. And if we look at how ruling classes and power elites are structured worldwide, we see that there's layers and hierarchies, just like there is in everything else. For instance, like Maupin, for example, has talked about the upper and lower levels of capital, and by that he means the traditional elites versus the nouveau riche and that kind of stuff. And I think that's true. That's certainly there. There's also the division between new money, old money, and very old money. And roughly speaking, new money is this new wave of the capitalist class that's come along in the last half century or so, rooted in financial capitalism and in digital capitalism. And that would be entities like BlackRock, which was founded in 1988. It would be entities like Amazon, which I think was founded in 1994. It would be people like Elon Musk and Warren Buffett and all of these kinds of people. This kind of new capital is eclipsing old money, which old money would basically be the products of the Industrial Revolution. That would be the Rockefellers, the Fords, the Carnegies, and that kind of stuff. And then very old money would be stuff that goes back to pre-modern times. That would be, the royal houses of Europe and the Vatican and all of that kind of stuff. And as new capital has become ascendant, it's become increasingly dominant. Just like the classical industrial capitalists managed to become increasingly dominant over the older royal and clerical and aristocratic elites, to where the bourgeoisie eventually became the dominant class, what was new money at the time. And that's happening again with financial capitalism and Dutch and industrial capitalism. And the question of how that affects geopolitics, I think, is something like this. If you are a commander of global finance capital, if you're one of these owners and controllers of global finance capital that Paul Kudnick and Shahi Bolson and others talk about, then what kind of world order do you want? Right? You want something where finance capital basically calls the shots in terms of what goes on internationally in international relations. You don't want major world powers that are able to override the influence of finance capital. You don't want states and countries that are able to do that. Now, if we look at the trajectory that these new capitalist elements have followed over the last 20 years, we see that they initially aligned themselves with old money and with the cultural left and with the political left. For example, that sort of peaked about 5 years ago during the Great Awakening. During the Great Awakening, we saw companies like BlackRock adopting ESG, or we saw companies like Bank of America and Amazon putting Black Lives Matter logos on their websites and adopting DEI programs. And in my view, all that was an effort for these ascendant capitalist sectors to align themselves with traditional elites, the WEF types and all that kind of stuff, and also to co-opt the cultural left, which was ascendant at the time. Right? For various reasons, that seems to have expired its utility. For instance, there's a lot more economic frustration now, and a lot of and politically, the general public seems to be turning towards populism. And also, there's a lot of feeling among normies that some of this woke, PC stuff has gone overboard. So there's been a pushback against that. Also, I mentioned the Zionist elite earlier. Obviously, they've lurched rightward in defense of Israel. All of that is a factor. So I think what's happened is that at the top level, global finance capital has looked at it like liberalism and the left has expired its utility and usefulness, and now they're moving towards other targets. For instance, they've decided, okay, we co-opted and basically ran the left into the ground with wokeism and all of that. Also, those sectors were initially very supportive of the Ukraine war, and they aligned themselves with the neocons and the liberal internationalists and traditional Western elites in defense of Ukraine. But I think they had totally opposite motivations. They weren't anti-Russian and pro-Ukraine and pro-Western, just the opposite. They saw the war as a means of actually weakening the West and weakening the United States and strengthening the BRICS axis that's emerged by pushing Russia and China and the BRICS countries closer together. And that's exactly what's happened. BRICS has come out stronger as a result of the Ukraine war. The West is weaker and more divided due to the Ukraine war. And I think that's what global finance capital was hoping would happen all along. All right, now that the global finance capital has successfully co-opted and weakened the left and liberalism, now they're moving in on the right. And what they want to do, I think, is co-opt populist nationalism and co-opt the national bourgeoisie or the industrial bourgeoisie of different countries and incorporate that into this kind of globalist, global system of financial unipolarity, but geopolitical multipolarity that they're trying to create. And that's why you've seen guys like Musk, for example, move towards Trump. And you've seen Larry Fink, who is the leader of BlackRock, he comes close now to being a world monarch. I mean, some of these overlords of global finance capital are now the equivalent of international monarchs. All right, he's also moved towards Trumpism. And that's not true just in the United States. It's also true in Europe. We're starting to see these same sectors moving in and trying to co-opt the nationalist right in Europe. For example, Nigel Farage's movement in Britain, or the AFD in Germany, or the Meloni government in Italy, or the Le Pen movement in France, or Viktor Orban in Hungary. So the goal seems to be that now that they've co-opted and discarded the left, they're going to do the same with the right. They're going to do the same with populist nationalism and with the national industrial bourgeoisie classes that tend to dominate the political right in Western countries. Now, as far as what these people overall envision, I think at the top level, the BlackRock types just simply want a system where financial overlords like themselves are de facto world monarchs. I think that the tech oligarch types, the Elon Musk, the Peter Thiels, the Mark Andreessens, the Jeff Bezos, the Mark Zuckerbergs, what they want is something kind of like what Curtis Yarvin envisions, which is a quasi-monarchical system in different countries where these tech oligarchs are the equivalent of a feudal royal elite that sort of or aristocratic elite that preside over their own fiefdoms, which in modern terms would be things like smart cities driven by AI and technological, highly sophisticated technological surveillance systems and all of that. And as far as the rank and file right wing, it seems like that most of that stuff is just being cultivated as useful idiots for this wider agenda. For example, if you look at the political right in the United States on the ground level, you have what? You have the nativists, the anti-immigration people, which is a well-established, American tradition going back to the 19th century. You have these low church evangelicals, most of which are now Christian Zionists. You have the paranoid style conspiracy theorists, as Eric Hoffer called them, which was the QAnons and that kind of stuff. So you have this kind of ground level hardcore populist right, and then you also have this wider base for the right that's more like the petty bourgeoisie and small capitalism. They only care about tax cuts and deregulations. They're very medium-sized, capital friendly. And then you have Sunbelt capital that's still there. Then you have the military-industrial complex. But I think all of that now is being co-opted by these three forces, by the tech oligarchs, by the Zionist plutocrats, the Bill Ackman, Miriam Adelson types, which are rooted in new money as well. Bill Ackman is a financier. The Adelson money comes from gambling. So Adelson was sort of like the stereotype of the Jewish vice merchant. And then I think at the top, very top of the pyramid is global finance capital, like BlackRock, like the sovereign wealth funds, like the central banks, like the transnational banks. And then all of that has different layers to it as well, because I think its function is it sort of connects the different layers and different generations of the ruling class together. For instance, Paul Kudnek argues, I'm not sure what the evidence is for that, but he argues from basically on circumstantial evidence that there seems to be something of a connection between BlackRock and Rothschild money, and you see other, possible connections within the ranks of these global elites. So it's these, it's this global finance capital that's an interconnector point between various ruling class sectors, and is now ascended to the top of the global pyramid. So we have this global unipolarity financially, the same role that the City of London, say, played in the 19th century, but multipolarity, just like the 19th century, where you had all the different regional colonial empires and their own spheres of influence. So I hope that wasn't too complicated.
Well, there's a lot there, Keith. So this is more of a question, but one thing to me that is a little, I'm not sure I'm entirely sold on yet is, I don't know if the global finance capital, so the city of London types, and which then moved over to New York when the U.S. became the world financier. Um, is China really a part of this? Because I mean, I see with the rise of Z, um, the idea of Lenin's taking one step back to take two steps forward. So China liberalizes in the 80s, the 90s, and the early 2000s, imports all this Western capital, schmoozes with all these people pretending to be, capitalism, sort of, socialism with Chinese characteristics. But now Z is returning to a one party state. It looks like, to me, everything from the death of Mao until now is the Chinese Communist Party taking one step backward, take two steps forward. And now that they have capital flight controls, which are very strict. So, for example, Elon Musk can't just up and pull his factories out because China won't let him. And so, is it really that China is a part of this? Because I still think China's socialist. I think that China is just taking one step back. What would you say to that, Keith?
Yeah, China is part of this, part of the owners and operators of global finance capital. The CCP is, basically just the Chinese equivalent of BlackRock or something like that. They're more and more integrated into this globalist system. Z is basically a modern Chinese emperor. I mean, they call their system socialism with Chinese characteristics, which basically means Confucianism. So Z is basically a modern Chinese Confucian emperor. Only he's got this modernist, quasi-Marxist, technocratic machinery of state that he presides over. Which is consistent with the Chinese civil service tradition and all that anyway. So none of this is a radical cultural departure for the Chinese at all, and it's also consistent with this, what I was saying earlier, analogous to the 19th century, where you had different empires with different spheres of influence geopolitically. Just like in the 19th century, France, for example, carved out a fairly significant empire for itself in Africa. Well, now China is doing exactly the same. China is basically colonizing Africa. I mean, it's a different model of colonialism. It's not military colonialism. It's what I call debt colonialism. It's basically, imperialism through loan sharking is what it amounts to. But no, I don't see that what China's doing is incompatible with this kind of analysis at all. I mean, their system is, fairly in keeping with Chinese traditions, and their approach to the global economy is fairly consistent with traditional imperialism or colonialism, modernized to contemporary circumstances. And then they have their own sphere of influence, just like Russia has its sphere of influence, just like the EU and America and other powers as well.
So we have a question for you, Keith, by a guy named Caravaggio. What's the surname of the Paul guy who believes that the city of London is running BlackRock? I think you just mentioned him a little bit ago.
Paul Kudenek. Let's see, you spell it Cudenec. I'm not sure what ethnicity that is, but he actually lives in England, and he runs a website called Winter Oak. Winter Oak. He's very environmentalist. That's his big thing, but he also does a great deal of analysis of international relations and geopolitics.
All right, Florian, there's a lot been said. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I would agree with lots of what Keith said, and with your role of questioning Z's role and the CCP role in all of this. And seems plausible that Z is basically China's Larry Fink. What I'm always thinking about is that we may get a new feudal age, but there's one problem, that people can now extricate themselves from the sphere of influence, right? So they use any online means. Bitcoin is like a proxy for all these online ways of making yourself anonymous, right? So that means that basically in the end, even BlackRock Larry Fink may be an emperor of nothing, right? if an emperor doesn't have subjects to obey him, then his power is pointless in a way, right? What I find also interesting, though, there's another aspect that people who have Bitcoin and they brag on social media about it, that has stopped because people got attacked. Like people had, I think there was even one movie where an influencer, a female influencer on TikTok, and she bragged with having Bitcoin, and then she got there was like four people running up to her house and trying to rob her, and she took a gun from one of them and shot one of them. And so, but that could have gotten easily the other way, right? So the problem is if people now have their self custody with wallets and their Bitcoin, basically, there's no bank anymore that that oversees the money. Now they become targets. And people don't rob a bank; they directly rob the people that have Bitcoin, and that also means they have to contend with less security than a bank has, right? So basically, what this means, if you look at the real rich people like Musk and Bezos and so on, they need to fortify themselves like a medieval king, right? I mean, how did a medieval king prevent that his knights were rising up against him and just taking all the wealth for themselves? Well, it was first they had a codex of they had a chivalry codex. So I think also many knights actually thought they would go to hell if they do something like that. So there's church indoctrination keeping them at bay. But also these people, these kings had holdings all over the country, right? So if you just depose of the king, you will only get a small part of his riches. And you have to have all those little tricks and strategies really to keep your security team in place to avoid that they're going to just overthrow you, right? So with Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, that becomes evident now. That becomes more necessary, and that will lead to itself, like in a way, like a feudal society where people have to have good security for themselves. But on the other hand, one way of avoiding such a fate is just being completely stealth, right? You could be rich, you could have million in Bitcoin, but you kind of decide to keep it very low, right? You just take out like a few couple $1,000s per month, and you live well, but you never buy flashy things, right? So stealth wealth, I think they call it. And these people, they will basically off the influence of any feudal lord that wants to rule over people, right? So that's what I'm wondering about. And feudalism in the end was destroyed by the invention of gunpowder. So that made violence that basically made it possible that via the advent of new ways of violence, power could be consolidated in central positions, which helped the nation state to emerge. But now there's now the invention of online living and Bitcoin and all that. You basically have people, they don't overthrow the concept of nation states with new ways of violence. They can just extricate themselves from reality and live on their own sphere of influence, and nobody really knows about them. So people become anonymous, and that is what kind of ends the nation states and will start people to be more sovereign. Those are ideas that you can read about in The Sovereign Individual, and also what by Rees-Mogg and Keith also points out The Network State by Balaji Srinivasan, talking about similar concepts. And that's an interesting counterforce, I think, to the attempts of global powers to carve up the earth into different spheres of influence, right? You have like entities that are not really part of that influence sphere, that do kind of their own thing, and that way reduce the power of those BlackRock like entities.
So there's a few things here. To add to your point about the feudalism, Florian, the other thing that ended feudalism was the Black Death. Once enough people died in Europe, the peasants could start renegotiating all of their terms of service. And of course, you still need the land worked, right? Yeah, so you have to eventually give some ground to these people. So we've had demographers and the world, the UN and other NGO institutions charting population peak and collapse around the world. And so if we view that as a kind of it's not really a Black Death event, but it has the same effect where there's just a lot less people. That could also be a serious challenge to the system because it would have a similar effect to the Black Death in the Middle Ages, ending feudalism. And as we've talked about before on the show, as the economy gets worse and worse for most people, they're going to turn more and more towards populist and even socialistic parties. I think there's the idea that you can sort of defeat an idea through force or through deception is false, because the idea still exists somewhere. It just takes one guy to bring that idea back. A good example would be the idea of a representative government, right? If you were alive in 1774, outside of, say, Switzerland, everybody would be like, oh, you can't bring back republics and democracies. We're all monarchies now, bro. And then, 1775, America, and now the monarchies got swept away. So I think what we could see is, you've pointed to this, Keith, the idea that we have overproduction of elites, people that are not, do not have the status and wealth that their education merits. They will be a sort of vanguard, if you will, that develops to exploit these sort of economic challenges that most people are going to be dealing with. The serfs, the peasants, if you will, right? And so, sticking with the medieval analogy, right, one of the things that made the Swiss or the Bohemians or the English so effective was they were able to organize the people to fight, right? The Bohemians had the war wagons, the Swiss had pikemen, and the English had the archers. And so you'll have these overproduced intellectuals. Some of them will then lead these people in what I would consider a labor movement, because how else are you going to get people what they need? There's there's various songs by Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger about this. Like, if you just want, was it Pete Seeger says, if you wait for the boss to give you a raise, you'll be waiting for Judgment Day. And so the idea is you have to take it into your own hands. And that's where labor organizing comes, and then you can start working your way up. That's all been kind of forgotten, but the literature's still there. You can still open an IWW book. You can still read, Lenin. You can still read Jack London, right? All of these guys, no one's reading it. No one's using it, but it's still there. So the idea, what I predict is a possibility, is that as the economy gets worse, and you couple this with automation too, right? With AI tools, you're going to put so many people out of a job. And then if we compound this with like self-driving trucks, we're looking at maybe 90% of the population losing their jobs. That's a revolution right there. That's a revolution, a political revolution. Now, and the question is, can they build enough counter gangs to actually diffuse this? I don't think they can. And furthermore, this is the thing: the actual revolution might begin as a counter gang, because what ends up happening is, with a lot of these, games that are played, people break loose, right? The CIA would talk about like rogue agents or rogue factions that broke loose from their control that they created, right? And so we could actually envision a scenario like that, where actually, in order to head all this off, the bourgeoisie does create a socialist or labor counter gang, and then it actually is a runaway snowball. It's so successful that it starts building its own base amongst the working classes in Europe and America. And also, as you said, Keith, the possibility of a North-South conflict where the industrial North is holding down the rising South. That could lead to a whole series of Vietnams, if you will, where there's these insurgent conflicts in Africa or South America where the North is trying to hold them down, and they just bleed themselves out, like the U.S. did in Afghanistan and like the U.S. did in Vietnam. And all of these independent forces could then converge and end the reigning hegemony of the bourgeoisie. Because I think what I feel is coming, and what I see is coming with all these trends, is a new class is developing. But as with any development of a new ruling class, it's hard to tell what it's going to look like before it takes power. But if you look at other late stage societies like feudalism before the bourgeois revolution, or the Roman Empire before it fell in the West, so the Germanic peoples, you could kind of see the writing on the wall that class was done. We didn't know who was going to replace it necessarily. That was still an open question. But I think for a variety of reasons that this class has reached the limits of what it's doing. So, for example, let's switch metaphors to the military. The reason why the U.S. keeps losing wars is everybody realized, hey, we can't beat the U.S. in a force-on-force conflict. They got more tanks, more bombers, more bombs and bullets. We'll fight them asymmetrically. And really, Vietnam was the real test case for this. And after that, everybody started doing it. The Islamists did it twice in Afghanistan against first the Soviets and then the U.S. I think what we're going to see is a kind of economic labor movement that fights asymmetrically, that is going to pick up on these ideas, these concepts from the military sphere, and then start fighting the bourgeoisie that way. And so they'll just, even though the bourgeoisie can out finance them in any day of the week, they're going to be fighting them in other sectors where they're weak, just like the Viet Cong or the Taliban did to the U.S. And eventually they can just chip away, and then it falls down. Now, such an organization doesn't exist yet, but I think that there's this historical, for lack of a better word, market for it. History is creating this environment in which such an organization could develop. And I think under the pressures of automation, declining economy, hubris and overreach of the bourgeoisie, we're going to see such a movement develop. But anything too specific is too soon to tell. Keith.
Yeah, well, to follow up on some of the things we touched on, first of all, the rising elites, these tech oligarchs and other similar figures, are actually creating their own little fiefdoms for themselves, in the sense that some of them are building retreats for themselves on remote islands. They internationally, you have these tax haven countries like the Cayman Islands and places like that. So they're actually creating these systems through which they can insulate themselves from any kind of institutional or popular retaliation. As far as models of repression, what was that movie years ago about some guy who, everywhere he goes, he's been sort of ostracized from society. He hasn't been put in jail, but his credit cards no longer work, and his phone doesn't work. I think it was that the Will Smith movie, Minority Report.
You mean Enemy of the State?
Enemy of the State, that's the one. Yeah. Enemy of the State. Yeah, it's. I think that model of repression is going to become more pervasive. Like, we already have this concept called debanking. And we've seen that actually used against dissidents of different types. Like I think Laura Loomer, whom I'm not a fan of, but I think she's been banned from virtually all social media. I think she's banned from Uber, and some of these alt-right people were banned from Airbnb. But that kind of repression, where you're using economic and technological sanctions rather than direct brute state repression. Like, when people think of repression, they think of stuff like, dungeons with torture chambers and death squads, and that still exists. I mean, you have that in banana republics like El Salvador, and you have these medieval fiefdoms like Saudi Arabia that where they chainsaw a dissident journalist to death. But that, I think, increasingly in the more sophisticated systems in parts of the world, we're going to see more and more of this kind of repression we're talking about now, like the film Enemy of the State. They're going to more and more use that kind of model of repression, as well as just through massive surveillance. Like, we already have these surveillance cameras everywhere we go. And these smart cities, I think, are going to be used for that purpose as well. And a lot of these tech oligarch guys are really big on developing these smart cities with this kind of AI-driven surveillance technology. So that's the model of repression we're headed towards. And I do think that there's going to be, as we've been talking about, a growing wave of dissident classes in the Northern Hemisphere, not just in the West, but also in China, Russia, Japan, Korea, places like that, of this overeducated underclass. And this is going to become a new revolutionary force, along with the rise of the global South. And as the global South rises, as dissident classes rise in the Northern Hemisphere, and as non-state actors rise of various types, that is likely going to have the effect of pushing the nation states of the Northern Hemisphere closer together, to defend their own collective interest. And what's going to be driving that is global finance capital. Global finance capital is going to recognize that they're being faced with insurgencies all over the place, and and the states that are largely under their control, they're going to have to bring those closer together as a form of collective defense. In Russia, for example, you have nowadays movements of people who want to fracture the Russian Federation into smaller countries, dominated by minority ethnic groups, particularly, say, in Eastern Russia and places like that. You also have demographic decline in Russia, in China. You've got similar ethnic insurgent forces in China. In the West, you see not only do you see the rise of populism, but then you also, on the more peripheral level, you see growing Islamist movements in the West and that kind of thing. So I think that all of this kind of stuff represents a future wave of revolutionary feeling or fervor that's probably going to emerge at some point in the future. And it's analogous to past things like that. It's going to be analogous to the Enlightenment era and the rise of the classical bourgeoisie. It'll be somewhat similar to the rise of the labor movement in the 19th and early 20th century, and also the kind of cultural uprisings we saw, say, in the 1960s, 1970s. Sort of a continuation of all of these things. I mean, we could even go back and find older analogies like the Reformation and that kind of stuff. So this seems to be a trend that's likely to develop worldwide at some point in the future against the dominance of global finance capital. And we'll see global finance capital trying to use technology and as a means of repression and maintaining control.
Well, but see, Keith, we know that's not going to work because that was the mentality in Afghanistan, and it just totally failed. Like, totally failed. Florian.
Yeah. So one thing with our predictions that you said that representative governments can come back. That's possible, and that's maybe a bit of a weakness of these books like Sovereign Individual and maybe also Network State. The authors just look back on what has happened. With history gives you very unique elements, so you have a very small sample size to make real predictions, and then they say, that these changes can take millennia even. So I think in the Sovereign Individualists still say that the change from the hunter-gatherer lifestyle to the agrarian society, that agrarian revolution is still going on, right? So sometimes these things take part on a large scale, and the question is how useful is the model really to predict anything from it, right? And with job automation, that is indeed a problem. It's always like there was this one guy, I've mercifully forgot his name. He ran for the Democrats, Andrew Yang, of course. Now I remember again, and he was talking about the problem with automation, and that was back in 2018, 2019, and it hasn't really manifested itself. In some cases, people put too much hope on automation. It doesn't work quite as easy. For example, Tesla brought out, and other companies are now bringing out humanoid robots, like the Tesla one they call Optimus, and this guy can serve drinks, can probably pick up, do gardening work, go to the store for you, repair your car eventually, and all these things. But for some applications, you can't use them. For example, I would like to have a tennis bot, the guy who always, like a robot who practices tennis with me, but it's too fast a game. So in that case, it can't work yet. So in some instances, also in daily life, robots aren't really that useful. So that makes automation also makes it slower, but also revolutions happen eventually, and then they seem to happen like all of a sudden, and everything was just taking place underground, right? So people think, oh, nothing has happened for a couple of years. Well, it may also mean that a lot of things are happening, but they are out of sight, and they're then like an exponential way. All of a sudden, they shoot up, go past the threshold massively. There's all these overnight events where people sold their company for billions, for example, overnight, but they worked in this company for 20 years, right? So change is So change can happen, things can become rapidly better or worse, but it's difficult to say, just because it hasn't happened yet, it won't happen. Now, on the other hand, when change goes on very slowly, then people can actually adapt. So when they got rid of the horse buggy by the advent of cars, they were able to get most of the people that worked on horse buggies. They got them to work on cars now, right? So it was slow enough transformation that you still had a way of getting all people still, schooled into a new job. If like one generation fades away with a certain invention and the new generation is like growing up with a new invention, like with the internet, then it's just the old generation just fades away and they don't get immediately unemployed, right? So that can also happen. And I think humanity, as Scott Adams said, has a good track record of reacting to slow rolling catastrophes that we see from far away. We're able to work something out against it. But as I said, the caveat is that maybe sometimes change will come and will overwhelm us, but it's just you just don't see it yet. Now, one thing, when you talk about enemy of state movie and that level of repression, I would like to also point out that Adam Townsend on Twitter talked about that. He pointed the movie Dark City, and it's basically a movie. I think it came out 1 year before The Matrix, and it's kind of similar. So it's a society in which some people have overtaken that. Then the ruling class basically has found a way to stop time. Every day at 12, time is stopped, and then people are placed into a completely different environment. So who had a family now sits there at the lunch table, all of a sudden now works in a factory, and people forget where they come from, right? So people basically don't have any past anymore because they're constantly moved around every day. And so that, of course, that's easy for the ruling class to rule their people, because if you don't have any past that you're bound to, then then you're like a leaf in the wind that can be put wherever the ruling class wants to have you. And we kind of already saw that with the measures that were taken for COVID, right? We don't quite remember how it was before COVID, what kind of freedom we had, what freedom meant to us, right? It's all erased. So that we were gathering with people and outside, it comes back a little bit, but it's never going to be as strong as it was before everything was locked down and you had this stupid social distancing stuff. That's just gone. And maybe you could also say similarly, what happened before 9/11, there's just ancient history, like wiped away with like 1 year of effort, or maybe you could even say 1 day of effort, right? So, and that is a real danger, because that's the counter-revolutionary force for the government and for ruling classes to push against any attempts of people to find their own way. And that is already happening. And I don't think maybe we should look a little bit more closely on that.
Yeah, so I think at this point we'll lead into the final statements. But one of the things that I'm going to say is just that, again, I would agree with Keith that the elite is leaning into a more digital mode of controlling society, and that the sort of digital revolution, which began in the 80s, is really probably more important than even finance, capital, or the military industrial complex. I mean, it needs them. They all kind of work together symbiotically. But it's fake. It's a fantasy. I mean, the world that these people live in is a complete fantasy. And we know it's not going to work because the people who fought in Afghanistan in the global war on terror thought just like this. The Bush administration had somebody who said, we create our own reality. Well, it turns out you don't. It turns out the Taliban still rules in Kabul. So reality is not something that's going to go away. Now, I don't propose yet who is going to replace them, but this kind of thinking just can't succeed. And we know this because we saw this. We also saw this in Vietnam, right? The idea that you can wage war according to spreadsheets. No, that's not war. That's not how it works. And of course, that's how the Viet Cong were able to undermine, subvert U.S. influence, not only in South Vietnam, but even in the U.S. itself. I mean, obviously, the anti-war movement was not controlled by the communists, But the communists played into that, right? They took advantage of the situation. And so I think ultimately that this system has it's at the high water mark, right? It's just like the Roman Empire at its height. It's at its high water mark, but then there's all of these cracks in the foundation that it refuses to see. So that's my final thoughts. Keith.
Well, one historical analogy that doesn't get mentioned quite a bit, but I think is appropriate, is to the overall trajectory that the Roman Empire um, traveled throughout its history. The Roman Empire was considered to have started when Rome was founded in 757 BC, and I think the formal date of the end of Western Rome is considered around 476 with the Vandal invasion. But if you look at the trajectory of Rome, it's very similar to the way the English speaking world has gone. If we say that the Norman conquest was really the equivalent of 757 BC in terms of the founding of what becomes this English world empire, and that of which the United States is a derivative, then the time period in history that would be analogous to the decline of Rome, like most historians will say, the decline of Rome started about 1,000 years later. It started in the roughly in the 200s AD, 300s AD, 200s AD. Well, that's about where we are now. We're about a 1,000 years after the Norman conquest, just like 1,000 years after the founding of Rome. You started to see the decline of Rome, the major period of decline, and that's kind of where the West is now. If the Western hegemony, as it developed in the early modern period, was rooted in it starts with the Spanish and the age of exploration and all of that, but it's really the rise of England, British English naval power, and then the Industrial Revolution, the beginning of that in England, and it's spreading to to Holland and Germany and to the New World, North America. The Western hegemony is predicated on all of that, and it seems like now we're entering this period of Western decline and the rise of other powers. Like I know I had a class on Chinese history when I was in college as an undergrad, and the professor was an American, but he had spent a lot of time in China and spoke Chinese fluently and all that. He'd been a tour guide in the Forbidden City, and he was saying that 500 years ago, you would have preferred to have probably have lived in China over the West, because conditions were typically better in China, circa 1500, than in the West. And we may be headed towards something like that. As we see Western decline, we may also see growth in other parts of the world, and not necessarily in China. They may experience decline as well in the future. It may be that in the future we see the global South, actually having better conditions. So we don't really know.
All right, Florian, you get the last word.
All right. I think there are many countervailing forces at play, right? So I think the future will be an equilibrium of like forces and counterforces, like nation states, empires versus BRICS-based smaller empires or smaller states, and sovereign network state-based independence. And there's AI automation mixed in with some inefficiencies, because there will be a sizable amount of people that still adhere to their past ways. So it's very difficult to predict what will happen. Some equilibrium of that, and ironically, we may be able to use AI to find out. But the last point I want to make is that maybe Keith is right. The global South will rise because there's still like a lot of, how do you call it, minerals to be found in Africa. Africa is extremely resource rich, right? And China has begun to exploit that. Other nations also, but there's like a vast wealth of to be found just in the earth in Africa. And so, if people in Africa figure out how to use it to their advantage, they may be in a very strong position.
All right. Well, thank you, Keith. Thank you, Florian. It's always a pleasure. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.